So you really gave a great introduction to, your path, because one of my questions was basically what inspired this collection. And my next question was, besides research, which I want to hear all about, hear a bit more about, is this whole process of the golden shovel. And I think the sort of process that you're talking about, having, your previous collection do really well. And obviously we want to talk about the Harlem Renaissance as much as possible and include authors of various genders and backgrounds, no shade to anyone. But to your earlier point, there are women poets who have just been forgotten. I was really fascinated by the bios that you included in the back of the book. And some of them have sad stories. This person went into obscurity, or this other person died in seclusion, and then you read this poetry and it's optimistic, it's aspirational, it's telling us to be the best that we could be. And we know that they had complex, fully rounded lives, and that your life doesn't get defined by one moment, whether it's dying in seclusion or falling off the literary map. But at the same time, we want to remember these women. So but anyway, back to the golden shovel. So I'm just interested, maybe if you could talk about your process. So as a reader, I'm reading through, and you highlight the moments where let's say I'm looking in the beginning, Heritage by May V. Cowdery, and you have the highlighted portions that are going to be used in the poem that you write, which is on the next page before, and you sort of break down the words that have been used, in the previous poem. That's part of that golden shovel process. So could you maybe walk us through just your method as an artist, as a writer, how that sort of comes about?
Sure. I mean, what I love about this form, it feels very sculptural to me, because you just have these few words that you've chosen, the striking line, whatever that is, or lines if it's plural, and you line the words up in the right margin one by one, and you have to create a new line that ends in each of those words. And what is that going to be? Is it going to be, are you telling a story that's on the same subject of the original poem, or are you going off in another direction? There are just so many ways to go with it. I mean, one of the things I love about the form. Two people can take the same striking line and end up with completely different poems. And I love that. But it feels sculptural in that you start off with words as if they were clay, and you're whittling away, and you don't really know what you have until it reveals itself. And I was like, oh, okay, that's what it's going to become, And I love that about the form. And sometimes I'm looking specifically for lines that speak to me, something that just jumps out, that just grabs me. And I respond to that. At other times, I have a particular agenda. I knew I wanted to write specifically, I wanted to write something about environmental issues. And so I looked for a line that would allow me to do that. And I found, of course, I'm not gonna be able to find it now that I'm looking for it. But I found one in a poem by Angelina Well-Grimke about the sun. And the red sun shouldered his way up. And I read that line, I'm like, that's the one. I can take that and run with it, and it'll give me the kind of piece that I want to write. Because when I initially saw that line, I immediately thought of the ozone layer. And so that led me to Faithful. The punctured ozone layer bleeds radiation, and we offer complaint without apology for the years of desecration Earth has suffered. Red is no longer the color of jubilation, but warning. The sun will now allow wildfires to run rampant. Nature shouldered the brunt of man's mistreatment too long. Now it's his turn to pay. Even so, it is the way of creation to be faithful. Notice, each dawn the sun comes up. So it sort of worked both ways. I'd take off on a line that I just came across in reading, or I'd specifically look for something that would allow me to go where I wanted to in terms of subject matter. But it was each piece was its own journey, its own exploration, and had its own sort of aha moments. And I love that for me, to have my own surprise, have experience of surprise as a writer, because you don't always have that. You know, you're always so much in control and got everything outlined, and and you have a few surprises along the way, but nothing like the number of surprises you have when you're working with this kind of form.
I'm so glad you read that poem. I mean, that's one of my favorite pairings. I have my favorite. I mean, I loved everything, but I have my favorites listed. But that pairing of At the Spring Dawn with Faithful, as someone who's interested in environmentalism and climate change, that really spoke to me. And what you were saying about sort of the process of using the words as clay and sort of thinking of the poems as sculpture made me think of the poem Four Walls by Blanche Taylor Dickinson. And I understand she's talking about sort of something else, but it makes me think of other poets that I've heard talk about writing sonnets or writing within really strict forms and being like, actually, there's kind of a freedom in boundaries sometimes. And so I wonder if that's your experience of the Golden Shovel too, because, you're able to take, Grimke's poem, which is sort of like celebrating the sun and celebrating nature, and then sort of bring us back to earth into 2021, where we sort of mess things up. And it's a call to action for us. So I thought that was a really interesting.
I find forms extremely freeing, and they allow me to write in a way that I couldn't otherwise, and to write poetry that would just never occur to me otherwise. They take me places. They take me on a journey. I love forms. And there are others I want to explore. I haven't finished with Golden Shovel. I kind of feel like I need to give people a rest, because I also did a picture book using this format, using this genre, called The Watcher. And it'd be a story about bullying. And I have no idea that that's what it was going to be. But again, the joy of just, the exploration and the aha and just following to see where it was going to lead me, following the words to see where they would lead me. So yeah, I find it very, very fascinating.
I have another question about form, and I hope folks in the audience, we have quite a few people on, so that's very exciting. I hope y'all are coming up with your questions, because we definitely want you to drop them in the chat so that we can answer your questions as well. But so you have the Golden Shovel as a through line throughout, but then you also have this kind of, framing narrative of sorts where it's like a young woman who is engaging in these with these poets, right? And so you have this opening poem, Whatever, sort of in her voice. So could you maybe speak to, that sort of larger frame of like I perceived it as a young Black girl or a young girl. I thought of my younger self, right? Picking this up and sort of being in that space where you're not sure your Black girl self matters just because of the messages that you get, right, from the world. It could be from your family or your neighborhood, or you could come from a very loving space, but the sort of larger media representations or things that you're getting might make you, internalize some negativity. So I'm interested in how you came up with that framing narrative and how how you want readers to engage with it or things like that.
Well, I was thinking about the audience that I was going after. I mean, I really focused very much on middle grade readers. I mean, it appealed to, older readers, younger readers, but really those of that middle group. And they have a lot of questions about who they are and their, strengths, weaknesses, whatever. They haven't quite formed their identity yet, so they're malleable and they're also very vulnerable, which is why social media is so deadly for that age group. because they don't have anything of their own to stand on yet. So I know that reader is going to have all kinds of questions about who they are and who they can possibly be. And so I really wanted to target in a very direct way that reader with the hope that by the end of the book, they will have picked up some tools and come away, encouraged, inspired, and realize that they have some building blocks for themselves, for their own futures, and to understand that the possibility for them is much broader than they can imagine, or that they ever have imagined up to the point. One of the reasons the biographies were so long, because usually biographies are not that long in the back matter, and I fought for that, and I was really grateful to my editor for giving me the space to tell these stories, because I was as excited about the lives of these women and their accomplishments. And, you have women who, one who studied at the Sorbonne, and you have one of the first African Americans, if not the first woman, to earn a PhD. And these are teachers and librarians and directors of cultural institutes, and they, they're well-traveled and well-educated, all of this in, early in the century. And so I want readers to understand, if these women could accomplish these things way back then, just think of what's possible for you today, And so I really wanted them to see sort of the breadth of these women. And so the biographies allowed me to do that. I also was hoping that by seeing this, they'd be inspired to do some digging on their own once they realize, oh, wait, what about this person? And let me look more into that, So I'm hoping that kind of thing happens as well. So this was the audience really that I had in mind, specifically for the book. And anyone else who comes to it, fabulous. But that was why I framed the book in the way that I did.
That definitely comes through, and I appreciate that there is that sort of reasonable reluctance that she has as like a speaker, as a poet. Like, it's like, I'm not really sure my teacher gets me, like, it's not like, oh yeah, I'm coming right along. I believe this immediately, because I think there's that adolescence or tween sarcasm or cynicism that, many of them have. Like, I know a lot, you don't understand where I'm coming from. It's very different being 12 or 13 or 11 in 2021 than it was in 1990 or 1950 or 1890 or whatever far off time they're thinking of. But actually there are lots of resonances between, Jessie Fawcett and a young woman today, right? Or, Angelina Grimke, Grimke and, a young queer person today, right? So I think that comes out really well. Can I ask you about the organization of the book? We talked a bit about the Golden Shovel, which I could talk about all day, but you have the book divided into 3 sections. So Heritage, Earth Mother, and Taking Notice. So could you talk a little bit about why you decided to organize it in that way?
Well, Heritage is all about issues of identity and self, the importance of naming ourselves, claiming ourselves, understanding ourselves, and not having someone else label us. The second section was really dear to me because I do not see enough in literature that reflects our engagement with nature, especially not in children's literature. And I'm all about seeing more of that. And I address that I have some picture books that are in process now where that is the focus, our engagement with nature, stories about our engagement with nature. And you had, poets like Anne Spencer, who was an avid gardener and wrote copiously about this subject. And there were other authors, obviously, that wrote about it as well, but she really sort of threw the door wide open because almost all of her poetry, has that impetus and that focus and that influence. And so I wanted to have a whole section dedicated to that subject matter. And going back to research, one of the books I looked into was Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry. And you'll have to go to the academic books to find this stuff. You don't find it in popular literature. And so I'm, in the even of these women poets, there's a wonderful collection, Shadowed Dreams, Women's Poetry, the Harlem Renaissance, which was a fabulous resource for me, but it's an academic text. And so if you're not in academia, you don't know about it, and you don't know about all the women that are in it. So there were poets who were new to me, but they weren't, completely undiscovered, but they was, not in the popular literature. And so I'm pulling from the academic literature in order to bring some of these women forward, because I think that's important. And then the third section is sort of a catch-all, because there were so many other subject areas and pieces that I wanted to include that didn't easily fall into, category 1 or 2. And so they became part of the third section. And understand that if I had been given more space, it would have been more poets and more poetry. Because one of the things I discovered when I really got into studying and looking for them, I thought, there must be 15 or 20. Try 60 or 70. I like it, okay? And I might find more if I kept looking. So just a treasure trove of this wonderful literature that we're not aware of. Gems waiting to be discovered, to be rediscovered. And not all of them published collections. Some published only one collection, or a few that published more than that. But they were all represented in the literary journals of their day, alongside their contemporaries. And more than that, several of them held salons where Langston Hughes and County Cullen and all these others, male poets, were nurtured. They were also often the editors of these journals that were publishing them, So we need to know that. Readers need to know that.
That's such an important point. And you mentioned that in the preface. Well, it's not quite, it's after both the preface and the Harlem Renaissance section, like you include the sort of historical facts that there are women who, whether we're talking about music, you mentioned Mozart's sister, but that there are all these women in the 19th century and early 20th century, and today, let's be honest, that are oftentimes in the shadow of their male counterparts, you know what I mean? And we can enjoy, all kinds of folks. When we think of like who's a public intellectual today that we think is really important, we might think Ta-Nehisi Coates, but there are all kind of women who are writing alongside him, right? So you can think of any number of folks, right? So, and that's true for the 1920s. So I love that you bring up like this person worked with Du Bois, but they published alongside him in particular kinds of ways, or the idea that there were these salons where women were sharing their work with one another, but not necessarily getting published at the same rate. And you mentioned as well in their biographies, this person published 4 poems, they didn't publish a collection. And I like the idea of just lifting up folks who maybe didn't get a chance because they were teaching full time, or they were librarian, or just for the simple fact that it's not easy to get published, whether it's 1925 or 2021. And that doesn't mean that their work isn't important. I think sometimes we have different bars to clear for Black women, whereas Emily Dickinson published very few things. And we read, I have a bachelor's and a PhD in English, and I can't tell you the amount of Emily Dickinson I've read in my life. And I love her, but there are Black poets, Black women poets, novelists, and so on, who should emerge from the shadows, and we shouldn't just, ignore them because they published 4 poems and no collections and so on. So that's a really important point. History is really interwoven really well throughout the collection, so I can see how young readers and grown-up readers could learn a lot, because I definitely learned a lot about poets that I had not even heard of. And I have taught courses on the Harlem Renaissance and have done the academic work, right? So, you definitely have enlightened me. Can we talk a little bit before we get into questions? So I want folks to drop their questions in the chat. We have an ask a question button, so be sure to drop your questions in for Ms. Grimes. What I also noticed in the collection is that there's all this beautiful art. And so I'm interested in the process that you had working with artists, or, and you include the artist bios, and they're not skimpy. They're really detailed bios so that we can go back and say, oh, I really like this picture. I really like this painting or collage. And you can go look their work up. So how did you come about working with the artists and so on?
Again, I'm thinking about, the difference between how men and women are treated historically. We all know about Aaron Douglas from that period. He wasn't the only one making art. There were women making art. Where are they? But that's another story. But the art, of course, is always critical. And I had a wish list that I went to the publisher with of artists. I always knew that I wanted Equa Holmes for the cover. That was like not even a question. That is who I want. Go to her first. I was really pleased that she was also agreeable to doing one of the interior pieces, which is now one of my favorite pieces of all in the book. That's the first poem before, and she does this gorgeous piece. And in talking with her recently, because we shared we shared a couple of events, she told the story of how she created this piece, and she showed a photograph of herself with her father that it was based on, that's sort of inspired it. And she added to it fictionally. I mean, there's another child and all this kind of thing, but I loved it. But the work is absolutely stunning. Every artist was invited to choose the poem they would illustrate. So of course, the people who signed on earlier had more to choose from. But I wanted that rather than to assign them something, because I wanted their passion to drive the piece. So they chose a piece that really spoke to them, that they loved. And that is the way to get the best possible illustrations as a result. And the work they did was just magnificent.
Yeah, it seems like a really organic collaboration. I wondered, sometimes authors don't always get to have that level of say-so when it comes to illustrations and art, but it read to me as very organic and very like synergistic, very like connected in particular kinds of ways. I know asking like, what's your favorite poem in the book is like asking about a favorite child or favorite pet or favorite something like that. I have my favorites. You read one of them, which is Faithful and At the Spring Dawn. I also really love Flag Salute and A Mother's Lament and Advice and Brown, Bronze, so many. And Journey's End is one of my favorites. But are there ones that really capture your heart or that you go back and forth on?
Yeah.
I know it's kind of like not a great question to ask, but I always.
Okay, but I thought about it because I knew you were going to ask me this question. So, okay, one for sure is Joy by Clarissa Scott Delaney, who is one of my favorite new to me poets. She died young, only lived long enough to publish 4 poems in her career, but what poems they were. And I loved the first line of her poem, "Joy shakes me like the wind that lifts a sail." And I responded to it with Leah's Reunion Excuse me. Let's see. Yearly, I join the celebration of women joy, the blessing of unchecked tears when calamity shakes us or when beauty surprises, the comfort of sisters cradling me when death slithers into the neighborhood like a rattler, striking yet another sweet sun, the promise of him broken. But there is also the cleansing wind of deep belly laughter as we gather round that love-worn kitchen table, licking morsels of each story that lifts us. Without this maternal crew's guidance, a brown girl like me would simply be adrift. No wind, no sail. I cannot imagine my life without the women in it. The women who raised me, the women on whose shoulders I stand, the women who are around me now. It would not be the same without the sisterhood we're blessed with. So that's definitely one of my favorite pieces.
Beautiful pairing. And I think, thinking back to the idea that there's a young woman engaging, a reader engaging these works, right? In a time where I don't want to say everyone's experience of being, in middle school or junior high or a young person is the same, but oftentimes there's that kind of perception of mean girl stuff, right? Or that idea that, I don't hang out with friends. I have associates, not friends. I remember that was a thing that was very popular to say when I was in middle school. Like, I just have associates, not friends. But every woman I know is beholden to a group of other women, right? And a group of other femmes generally that, like, I'll speak for myself as a queer femme, that it's family. We may not be blood related, right? Sometimes we are, but they become sisters, they become family in particular kinds of ways, chosen family, folks that you say, even if I wasn't related to you, or even if I didn't work with you, or even if I wasn't, living nearby with you, I love you, I care for you, I treat you this particular kind of way, you treat me this particular kind of way, you're part of my network in a particular kind of way. And I think it's important for young readers to figure that out, that you need a crew, and you use the word crew, maternal crew's guidance. If you need your girls to hold you up, to be a mirror to you, to hold you accountable, to call you out, to call you in, to do all of those kinds of things, it's really important. And I think there's so many messages that say you can't trust other women. And to combat that early on and to say, actually, it's really important to trust other women is so key. I think that's really important. Could you talk a little bit about, I mentioned Flag Salute, which to me reads like...
Don't even go there. Let me talk about it.
Okay, go ahead.
Because Esther Popel is another one of my favorite new to me poets.
Uh-huh.
Her poem, Flag Salute, a dark commentary on the Pledge of Allegiance, is stunning. Not only that, but it could have been written today.
That's what I was going to say.
A special dedication to Colin Kaepernick. That's how relevant it is. And I thought, I don't know how deep I'm going to go into this, but I definitely have to respond to it. And so I wrote A Mother's Lament. Ancestral blood waters cotton fields and the earth I stand on. A history begun under lash, no pledge of liberty until war forced it. My people's allegiance to country was wrung from hearts of hope, to one day be treated equal to the sons of the ones who shipped us naked to these shores under freedom's flag. Yeah. Esther
was telling the truth. This poem, I mean, they worked so well together. if you read Esther's poem, I'm saying Esther like I know her, but I feel like I know Esther. If you read Esther's poem today with no preface, you would think that this was a poet who was alive right now and who was just, around talking about things today. I mean, there's some references to the past. It's a poem about lynching, a murder in the style of 33, right? So it's referencing, earlier times. However, unfortunately, the topic is so relevant, and the descriptions that are so poignant, the imagery of white folks standing around and participating in the violation of a Black person's body and bringing, of men and boys and women with their babes brought out to see the bloody spectacle. We see that. I mean, we're only 2-3 weeks out from an attempted coup / a real coup. We can go onto YouTube and torture ourselves with videos of police stoppings and murders and all that. I mean, there's so much video evidence, right? Just as there was photographic evidence of the barbarity of lynchings and the glee with which people participated in them. And I think there's this idea, you've probably seen these shirts or these memes where it says something like, "I'm not my ancestors, you can catch these hands." And I hate those shirts because they sort of imply that folks in the early 20th century or 19th century were weak, that they were punks, that they lay down. And all you have to do is read Esther. This is, to me, as poignant as If We Must Die by Claude McKay, It's that same level of energy of, I'm calling this injustice out. I mean, all you have to do is read the work of Ida B. Wells, we are doing this work. And so that middle grade reader or that middle-aged reader who is, sort of tapping into these words can get that energy. This is not something from 2021. This is something that we've been doing. It's literally our legacy, right? Exactly. I think it helps to combat that inaccurate and ahistorical kind of sentiment, like Esther was on it and so were these other women. So
I'm all about building the bridge between past and present. And I go back to these historical pieces, even though I write a lot of contemporary work, but I love this work also because I want readers to understand these connections and to realize that people of the past have something to teach them and to share with them that is relevant to their lives today in a way that they might not see otherwise. They might automatically think, oh, well, that was then. It has nothing to offer me. And nothing could be, more untrue. So, yeah, that's part of the reason this work feels important to me.
It's absolutely relevant. And I want to go back to something that you brought up earlier. You said that, the collection is far from slim, but, you were sort of constrained, right? Constraints as an editor, as a collector, as a poet. If you could do a legacy part 2, what sorts of topics would you want to cover? Are there other poets that you'd want to include? Like, tell us if there could be, and there should be, a part 2, 3, and 4. But if you could extend this project, what would you include and what would you want to talk about?
I'm not sure. I would have to see what spoke to me in the moment, but I'm always looking at the moment. I might look for things that connected with a pandemic, because we spent so much time in it, or that spoke to the idea of quarantine or being isolated, because there's versions of that throughout history. I don't know what else I would be looking for, but there certainly are many other women I'd like to bring to the fore. The other thing that happened, which always happens with research, you go down these rabbit holes and you find things you never anticipated. I was pleased to discover that many of these women wrote poetry for children at a time when we didn't even know that was happening. And you had the Brownies book, was a sort of a little bit like highlights for today, with stories and poems and games and whatnot, specifically for children, for Black children. A couple of them wrote collections. Some of them, I think Effie Lee Newsom was responsible for starting the children's column in, I believe it was Crisis. And so when I found out, I thought, ooh, I'd like to dig up some of that poetry. And I started some research, found some work on microfiche, got it through, interlibrary loan, and I had to stop myself. I'm like, yes, but this is not the book you're working on right now. So I stopped. But definitely I want to go back to that at some point and explore further. But for sure, I can see myself doing additional collections, focusing on more of the women that I found.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that in the bios. Like a lot of them were educators, librarians, teachers of all sorts of grades, in addition to going to the Sorbonne and getting, graduate degrees and just being generally very busy. I wish I had the level of energy that those women had to be doing all the things that they did. I'm like, and I and do other things too. So they really were multitasking Renaissance women in all senses of the word. But I noticed that there was all this emphasis on children's literature in a particular kind of way that was really interesting. And interesting considering, like the concept of childhood has changed over time, and there are ways in which Black children get adultified, right? You're 6 or 7, but you're a grown woman, whereas a white person who's 30 or 40 is still referred to as a young person, right? Tamir Rice at age 12 was considered to be grown when he was just, playing with a toy gun. But there has been this sense in our community where we have really thought about children's issues and concerns in art, whether it's, paintings or collage, but then obviously in poetry and literature. So, again, going back to what you said earlier, building a bridge, right? This is not simply stuff that we've been doing in the late 20th or early 21st century, but it goes back to the earliest parts of our tradition that we've been focused on children and their concerns and sort of introducing them to poetry in particular kinds of ways. I wonder, this is sort of like a selfish pedagogy question, because when I read the collection, I was thinking, when I teach poetry in my African-American lit class, I want to use the golden shovel as like a way for my students to write poetry, right? Like I don't teach creative writing,
Absolutely.
But sometimes, students, and I was even that kind of student where I'm like, poetry is so intimidating. I don't think I understand it, and what I find is if you get someone to write a poem or write a, piece of flash fiction, that intimidation factor goes down and the appreciation factor goes up because they see how hard it is to write something, right? They're not like, oh, this person slapped together these words. It's like difficult. So I'm interested in any kind of experience you've had with workshops or with young people sort of talking through the golden shovel method or things of that nature.
I have done poetry salons with elementary, middle, and high school students where I introduce the golden shovel, and they eat it up. And I think it's because, well, for one thing, children aren't afraid of things the way adults are. My adult poet friends were like, oh, I can't do that. I was like, that's too hard. And the children are like, okay, let's have at it. But I think part of it is because they have something to start with. They have a line. I give them poems, and I have a few poems, and I have lines for them to choose a line, choose a striking line, something that speaks to you, something with an active voice, whatever. And they take it and they run with it. And now and I hope this would happen, there are teachers who are using it and exploring it in their own classrooms. And through Twitter, through Facebook, whatever, they're posting, golden shovel poems that their students have written. And they're just having a lot of fun with it and exploring subjects that they wouldn't have otherwise, which is great. So it's a wonderful tool to stimulate writing for sure. at every age level. So yeah, go for it. Be surprised at what you do.
I'm definitely going to do it. Whenever I have my students do more creative projects, they eat it up. They have a great time with it, and so over the years, I've definitely moved away from just teaching or having them do traditional paper. So I have them do all kinds of things, video essays, pastiches, all sorts of things. But just particularly in class, getting your mind going by really paying attention to the words, right? The diction. Why did they use this word versus that word? I think is really important.
Well, this form has so many possibilities. I mean, it's not just poetry. You can borrow a line from your favorite song lyric, or it could be a line that you came across in a paper art. It could be whatever just take a striking line from a variety of sources and use that as your jumping off place. So it has all kinds of possibilities to explore and play with. And poetry, after all, at the bottom, it's wordplay. I'm all about wordplay. And this gives them an opportunity to play, gives them some words to play with. And there's no wrong way to do it. That's the other thing. Like whatever you do is fine. There isn't a right or wrong here.
I think that's really important for people to know. Yeah. So I'm asking if folks have any questions, because I've been talking a lot. We've been talking a lot. I have lots of questions. I can yap all day, but I don't want to monopolize our time. So if folks have questions, you can drop it in the chat. And there's also a specific place where you can ask a question to Ms. Grimes about legacy women poets of the Harlem Renaissance. As folks are coming up with their questions and being less shy, I want to ask you, what do you have on your nightstand right now? What are you reading?
Oh, gosh.
Mm-hmm.
What am I reading right now? I have 3 books. And trying to remember the titles. One is by, A.S. King. It's memoir. Not really memoir. It's like memoir fiction. No, that's not it. Oh, I'm not going to be able to do this. I can tell you I'm reading one by Renee Watson.
Love her work, yes.
A.S. King. And I can't think of a third right now. Sort of all over the place in my reading. Sorry.
No worries. I'm just always interested in what authors are reading, with your ample free time.
Well, I also have a couple of manuscripts I'm reading to blur, which takes up some of my time as well. I don't do a lot of that, but every now and then I can say yes to blurbing about. So.
And what are some other things that we can expect from you down the pike?
Oh, let's see. I mentioned a couple of nature-themed books. One is called A Cup of Quiet. It's about a grandmother and child discovering sounds of nature in celebration of that. One is a walk in the woods, a story in poems about a young man whose father just died, and he's kind of wrestling with that loss. And he and his dad used to go for walks in the wood all the time, and he hasn't been since his father dies. But then his father leaves him a map, a treasure map that takes him back to the woods. Yeah. It's a special piece. I collaborated with Jerry Pinkney on. We've been wanting to work together for years and years and years. And this is a piece that really grew out of a conversation. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I have a collection of adult poetry called Glory in the Margins, Sunday Poems, which comes out this fall. I have a graphic novel version of one of my novels in process. And I'm just getting ready to start a new novel. So yeah. But I've slowed down.
Have you? Because I'm trying to figure out.
There's no evidence of it, but you know.
Okay. I'm glad that you figured that out because you listed like 20 things just now. And I mean, I'm very grateful to hear that you have that many things going on, but it doesn't sound like how do you work on so many projects at once? Like what's your
Well, I don't work on them at once. I work on them one at a time. So the picture book manuscript, well, one is done, one is I have some slight revisions, but mostly done. The poetry collection is done. That grew out of, I'm poet laureate at my church. I create poems to accompany the sermons many weeks of the year. Been doing it for several years. And so this collection is a compilation of some of those poems. So that's already done. I'm trying to create a space now so that I could begin work on the new novel. And I also have new ideas for poetry collections sort of away. And what I do is I just jot them down enough so that I can remember them and put them aside and make them wait their turn. Because invariably when you're working on one thing, it sparks something else. You know, it just always happens. So I've learned to just jot enough down so that I can return to it when the time is right. So that I can just focus on one book at a time, one story at a time.
So you're not just hopping all around like.
No.
Like, oh, this new thing over here.
Yeah, I did that when I was younger and then I learned better. It's like, yeah, let's not do that anymore. Let's just work one thing at a time.
I'm trying to learn that. So what would you say? We have 88 people watching right now, and many more people will watch on YouTube later at their own, leisure. I'm sure there are folks in the audience who are writers, some maybe published writers, some burgeoning writers who maybe want to write poetry for middle grades or YA or for adults. Is there sort of advice that you would give, besides the great advice that you just gave about focusing on one thing and writing down those ideas so that you don't lose them, but you don't focus on them? Are there other pieces of advice in terms of method, things to read or so on, just ways to go about doing this work?
My general advice is always read, and write. Your writing is always going to be influenced by the quantity and quality of reading that you do. And read across genres. Don't just read whatever your favorite genre is, because every genre, when done well, has something to teach you. And then write, because writing is a muscle that has to be exercised. There's no way to jump over the bad writing to get to the good. Would that it were so, but it isn't. We all know about the crummy first draft. I'll clean that up. That we all write, that you have to write in order to get to the good one. So you have to learn to just trust your process and know that as you keep working, you're going to get the result, that you want. Specifically, if you want to write for children, you need to be reading children's literature. If you want to focus on middle grade, read middle grade. You want to focus on YA, read YA, see what's out there, so that you have a frame of reference in terms of what works for each age group, what doesn't work, that sort of thing. Yeah. And then just be intentional about it.
We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Let's see. Donna asks, "Do you ever make art for your books, or are you involved with other forms of the creative arts?"
Oh gosh, yes. In one last word, actually, one of the illustrations is mine. There's work that's over my head right now. That's one of my pieces on the wall. One with the hair. It's watercolor collage. I do textile work. I do collage. I do watercolor and collage. I do bookmaking, jewelry making, drawing. Yeah. So yeah, lots of art in my life. Very, it's kind of another way to breathe for me. I make my own cards. Sometimes if I'm really stressed out, I will declare, okay, today is a card making day, and I will make cards all day. Or today is drawing day, or I'll get out, my watercolors, and that's what I'm going to do for the day. And it allows me to breathe in a different sort of way. It satisfies something in me that the writing doesn't. So for me, it's not an either or, it's a both and. I need them both in my life. So yeah, I'm a maker for sure.
Yeah, and I think that synergy between different kinds of making, right? That doing something with your hands, writing, I think that makes a lot of sense that they're sort of connected.
Yeah.
Another question we have is, can you speak a little bit about the process of writing your book about Kamala Harris, our new vice president?
Yes. Well, I started out with the idea that I wanted to introduce the story in the same way I'd done with the Barack Obama one, where I had an exchange going between mother and child. And the reason I did that in both books is because I want to bring in the younger reader, or the somebody who's maybe hasn't started reading. Maybe he's only going to be read to, but I wanted them to have a voice that they recognize as their own, as part of that story. And so, so I have Eve having this conversation back and forth with a mother, and it also gives me an opportunity to explain ideas like justice that, a younger reader wouldn't necessarily understand. So sort of break down some of those concepts for the youngest reader who's going to engage with this book. I was fortunate in that there was so much written about her, and she had also written herself. So I could get a sense of her own voice, and also pull out from her story for adults stories that had to do with her childhood. Just small moments that an adult reader would probably go right on past, or that I went looking for. Like, the whole incident of her making lemon bars and using salt instead of sugar, that kind of thing. Those sorts of moments. But particularly I was looking for what made her who she is. What were the seeds that were planted in her childhood that connect with what she's doing now and who she is. And I found those in all of the reading that I did. And so I was able to bring those to that story. And I just found it, just fascinating. She seemed to really be created for exactly what she's doing now. She had a childhood where she was exposed to, the issues of justice and right, and fighting for the little guy, and, all those sorts of ideas, and the sense of responsibility about caring for those who can't care for themselves, and speaking for those who can't speak for themselves, some of which she got from the church as part of her childhood experience. So that really was my focus in telling the story. And then, of course, bringing in the more recent history. When I was working on the book initially, because I started work on it, he approached me in March of 2019. So she was running for the nomination. By the time I got to the last pages, she was dropping out. So I had to go back and decide, okay, how I was going to treat that in the story. And then, of course, the book goes on to press before she's picked by Biden to be his running mate. And I was like, oh, now what? And then I have to sort of see how that played out. So I had already started talking to the publishers about editing and updating the information. You know, we had already talked about updating the timeline. But then when the election happened, it was like, okay, now we have to really, update this, make a new edition with a brand new, wonderful ending. So it was the most pleasing and joyful revision I've ever had to do in my life, to create the newest edition with her as Madam Vice President. And then paired with the extraordinary Laura Freeman, when I saw the cover for the book, it took my breath away. It was just stunning the way she had incorporated the lotus, the meaning of the name of her name, and all the key people in her life reflected in that piece. Oh, I just was stunned. And then all of the other work in the book as well. So yeah, I kind of struck lightning with that one.
Are there other public figures? I mean, you've written previous picture books and other books about kind of notable public figures. Are there folks in the future that you'd like to write about that you haven't yet?
No, I mean, not offhand. I don't really go out for notable figures. And it's the kind of thing I never imagined myself doing. I mean, the photography I did was of Bessie Coleman, just fascinated with flight and the idea of her, being the first woman pilot, Black woman pilot, and how she became that pilot. I mean, having to learn French in order to go to France to study aviation because there were no schools for Blacks, let alone women, in America. Just fascinating. And just all the math that's involved. I had some friends who were pilots, so I really got to understand sort of the inner workings of that science and how much math is involved, and how complicated the whole process of flight is. And oh my gosh, I thought, wow. And she did that with all that she had going against her. It's just amazing. So that was definitely a story that I wanted to tell. I also look, though, for stories that have a faith component, where that works into, is an important part of that person's story. And so that very much appealed to me about each of the people I've written about. That's been like a central theme. So we'll see.
Well, we're definitely going to be on the lookout for whatever it is you decide to do next. I mean, you mentioned, I'm not trying to add more work to your load. You did mention about 12 upcoming projects. So we're ready to read whatever it is you write. So I'll ask if folks have any questions, any final questions before we wrap up. But this has been a really awesome way to spend a Saturday afternoon, just in conversation, learning so much. I can't wait to order this for all the young people in my life. As I said to you before, I think that I hope it's in every library. I mean, I was that kid that just went through, the library and was like, okay, I'm going to take it. You know what I mean? But I know that that's not everyone's experience, right? And poetry can be intimidating for some, or it can be an entry to other things, you know. It just depends on how you are as a reader. But I hope that folks who haven't gotten the book yet or haven't pre-ordered, please go ahead. We have a link down here at the bottom where you can buy it. Go to your library, take it out, read it yourself, read it to others, teach it. It's just a great collection. And I'm here for a legacy too. I mean, no pressure, but.
And the art is so stunning, it makes it almost like a coffee table book. I've had people say that to me.
It is a beautiful book for all ages. So we really think if folks are on here and they're thinking about getting it for their child, they may actually be wanting to take it for themselves as well.
Buy 2 copies.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. So I want to thank everyone for hanging in with us through our little AV difficulties. I really appreciate it. I want to thank our friends at the Auburn Avenue Research Library who have dropped all of these amazing resources in the chat. As always, you can make an appointment with the research librarians there. They are closed for browsing right now, but they are open online, and they have some beautiful like children's book collections that you can browse online. You can check in with them, and if you want to do your own research, or you want to dig more into Harlem Renaissance work, or you want to dig more into poetry, this is a great time to do that. They have so many beautiful resources, and because they're not serving the walk-in public right now, this is a great time to go do your personal project. So even if you don't think you're an official scholar, so many books start because of your personal curiosity. So please do pursue that curiosity. We need more books. There's always more room. And as Ms. Grimes said, there are so many people who we still don't have as much knowledge about as we should. So it's, there's a lot of people in this book that even if you think that you are kind of, really well versed in the Harlem Renaissance, they're going to surprise you, which I think is an amazing gift. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat because I didn't get to do my full introduction because I was having AV troubles. But Ms. Grimes has written so many books that you're going to recognize. So I didn't get to read all of them out at the beginning, but you can buy them all from Charis. You really are a huge, really giant of children's literature, and it's a real honor to get to have you here. So we're very grateful to you. Thank you, Susana, for this chat. As always, this was a really lovely time. So
it's my pleasure.
Bye all. Thank you.
Everybody stay safe and well, and we hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.